My sister's kids sent me a $6,000 Christmas wish list, a drone, 2 iPhones, cash for tattoos. She called me cheap, called me the rich uncle. I smiled and said nothing. Then I showed up Christmas morning with 12 boxes and 1 sealed envelope. The text came in on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a chart I was finishing between patients. A group message from my sister's kids, listing gifts like the whole thing was already guaranteed, a done deal, nobody had bothered to run past me first, a $200 drone, a PS6, still 3 months from release and already sold out on pre-order, 2 iPhones, latest model, cash for future tattoos, a line item I read twice, certain I'd misread it the first time. I asked, half joking, if it was a joke. Melissa answered instead of them, her name popping up in the thread a few seconds later like she'd been waiting with her thumbs hovering over the screen. Don't be cheap, you're the rich uncle. That line stuck in my chest like a splinter, small and sharp and impossible to fully dig out with one hand while I was holding a stethoscope in the other. I'm Andrew. I'm an ER doctor in Columbus. I work nights, drink coffee burnt enough to strip paint, and keep a spare set of scrubs folded in the back of my Honda Accord because life doesn't send you a warning text before it breaks something. In my family growing up, I had one assigned role, understood by everyone without ever once being said out loud. I was the reliable one. Melissa was the free spirit with expensive habits, 4 years younger than me, the one my parents called spontaneous, and I quietly called in the privacy of my own head a pattern. We weren't rich, not by any measure that mattered, just an ordinary Ohio family with a worn-out house on a street with cracked sidewalks and a household budget stretched thin enough to squeak. Since medical school, I'd sent money home whenever things got tight, which was often. It felt automatic at first, not sacrifice exactly, just what you do for people you love. Years of automatic became years of expected. I paid rent emergencies without being asked twice, car payments when Melissa's Civic needed a transmission she couldn't afford, school fees for my niece and nephew that somehow always landed on my card instead of hers. I drove across town on double shifts because Melissa didn't like taking the highway at night. I said yes so many times, for so many years, that saying no had quietly started to feel, in my own mind, like the actual crime. I should explain how we got to that Tuesday text, because 11 years of small yeses don't add up to a $3,200 drone overnight, and I think the shape of that slow accumulation matters more than any single moment in this story. There was the time I covered Melissa's security deposit at 1 a.m., still in scrubs after a 12-hour shift, while she cried on speakerphone about a landlord who just didn't understand her situation. There was the time I paid for my nephew Tyler's travel soccer league because every other kid on the team had a sponsor, a sentence Melissa delivered with total, unblinking sincerity, as though sponsorship for 11-year-olds recreational soccer was a standard and reasonable expectation. There was the birthday dinner, my own birthday, where Melissa ordered the most expensive bottle on the wine list without asking anyone else at the table, then slid the check toward me at the end without a word, like the arrangement was simply understood by everyone but me until that exact moment. There was the Easter 2 years back when she borrowed my car for just the weekend and returned it 11 days later with a cracked windshield and no explanation beyond a shrug and a promise to figure out the repair eventually. I told myself it was nothing, every single time. Family helps family. That's what our parents raised us to believe, and I genuinely didn't want to be the brother who kept a ledger, tallying every dollar against every favor like love was a spreadsheet instead of a relationship. I let it go, year after year, because the alternative, actually saying no, actually holding a line, felt each time disproportionately cruel, given how little any single request cost me compared to what I made in a year. I didn't understand scrolling through that group text on a Tuesday afternoon between patients that rich uncle wasn't a joke or an insult. It was simply the final, honest label for a role I'd been quietly performing for over a decade, one nobody in my family had ever once asked whether I actually wanted. A few days after the wish list arrived, I drove out to my parents' house on my one day off that week, mostly to fix a chirping smoke alarm my mother had mentioned needed a battery. Melissa was there too, sitting on the couch scrolling her phone, not looking up when I walked in. "You're a doctor," she said, as though that single fact settled every open question in the room. "You can afford it." My father wouldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at the muted television. My mother stood at the kitchen counter, cutting fruit slowly, methodically, the specific, unhurried motion of someone deliberately pretending not to hear a conversation happening 10 feet away. I didn't argue that day. I climbed the step stool, swapped the smoke alarm battery, tested it twice, and drove home in silence, the radio off, turning the phrase "rich uncle" over and over in my head like a stone I couldn't quite skip across the surface of anything. I told myself it was nothing, just Melissa being Melissa, my parents being conflict-averse the way they'd always been, nothing that a calm conversation couldn't eventually smooth over. I let it go, the way I'd let go of 100 smaller moments before it. But that night, alone in my apartment, I opened my banking app for reasons I couldn't fully articulate at the time, and started scrolling backward through years of transfers. What I found, scrolling back through 5 years of transaction history at nearly midnight, stopped me cold in a way the group text alone never could have. Dozens of transfers. Not occasional emergencies the way I'd always mentally filed them, but a steady near-monthly drumbeat. $400 here for just until payday, $850 there for a car repair, $200 for a security deposit, deposit, $600 for soccer fees, repeating, compounding, never once repaid, never once acknowledged as anything other than simply what I did. I pulled up a spreadsheet, old professional habit, the same instinct that made me chart every patient interaction meticulously, and started actually tallying it, dollar by dollar, for the first time in over a decade. The number that finally populated at the bottom of that column made my hands go still on the keyboard. $34,600 across 5 years, not counting the countless smaller favors that never touched a bank account at all. The driving, the covering shifts so I could pick up Tyler from practice, the emotional labor of being the sibling everyone called first when something broke. I told myself even then, staring at that number, that it was nothing unusual for a family that loved each other. I closed the laptop and went to bed, still telling myself some version of that story, though something in me had already started to shift, quietly, underneath the rationalization. The following week, I tried gently to raise the subject directly with Melissa over the phone, hoping a calm, private conversation might land differently than a group text ever could. I saw the wish list, I told her. I can't buy everything on that list, Mel. It's over $6,000 combined. You can't, or you won't, she asked, her voice sharpening instantly, the warmth from a moment earlier evaporating. I won't, I said, and I remember how strange the word felt in my own mouth, unfamiliar, like a phrase in a language I hadn't spoken in years. Wow, okay, I guess we know where we stand now, she said, and hung up before I could respond, the dial tone sitting in my ear for a long moment before I finally set the phone down. I told myself one more time that this was simply Melissa being dramatic, that a few days of frost would pass the way it always had. I let it go briefly, though the exhaustion underneath the rationalization had, by that point, become impossible to fully ignore. That answer, I won't, changed something in me I didn't yet have the language for, sitting alone in my apartment at 2:47 a.m. After a shift, staring at a ceiling I'd stared at 1,000 times before, without ever once feeling this particular flavor of tired. The breaking point, when I finally understood it clearly, wasn't anger. It was exhaustion, the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of realizing you've spent over a decade functioning as someone else's financial safety net, without ever once being asked whether the arrangement worked for you too. I didn't want to simply cut Melissa off and walk away entirely. Despite everything, she was still my sister, and Tyler and my niece Ava were still kids who deserved better than becoming collateral damage in an adult argument. So instead, over the following 6 weeks, I built something, not a punishment, a structure. I met first with a family financial counselor, Renata Ochoa, a certified financial planner with 14 years of experience specifically working with families navigating what she called dependency dynamics, situations where one family member had become, functionally, an unpaid financial institution for another. Renata helped me draft an actual written plan, what I would continue funding going forward, under what conditions, and what I would no longer fund at all, regardless of circumstance. We met 3 times over 2 weeks, each session running longer than scheduled because there was more history to untangle than either of us had anticipated on the first call. What you're describing, Renata told me during our second session, reviewing my 5-year transfer spreadsheet with visible surprise at its length, isn't generosity anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time. It's enabling, dressed up as love, and the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved, including Melissa, is to stop absorbing consequences that were never yours to absorb in the first place. She said it plainly, without judgment in her voice, the same clinical, steady tone I imagined she used with every family who walked into her office, believing their situation was somehow uniquely shameful. I also reached out to a licensed family therapist, Dr. Marcus Webb, who specialized in adult sibling dynamics and family financial enmeshment, to ask about resources I could offer Melissa directly, not ultimatums, but genuine pathways if she chose to take them. Dr. Webb helped me compile a list of accessible counseling services, budgeting workshops through a local nonprofit, and job placement resources through Ohio's Workforce Development Program, since Melissa had been between steady jobs for the better part of 2 years. He was careful in our one call to remind me that none of this guaranteed a particular outcome. You can build the door, he said. You can't make anyone walk through it. That part has to be hers. And I spoke briefly with an old college friend now working as a family law paralegal, Jenna Osei, mostly to understand my own legal footing regarding informal loans that had never been documented, confirming, as I suspected, that none of it was recoverable as debt, and that whatever came next would need to be about future boundaries rather than past repayment. Jenna also, unprompted, offered to pull together a list of current local job openings that might actually fit Melissa's background in retail management, a small kindness that ended up mattering more than the legal advice itself. I drafted the final document myself late one night after a shift, laying it out the way I'd lay out a discharge plan for a patient. Clear, specific, no ambiguity left for anyone to misread later. Grocery support tied explicitly to attending counseling appointments. A defined monthly budget contribution contingent on Melissa engaging with Renata's financial coaching program. A list of job openings Jenna had helped source through local staffing agencies. And one final, unambiguous line, underlined twice. I will no longer fund undocumented cash requests, luxury purchases, or expenses framed as emergencies without prior conversation. This is not punishment. This is the beginning of something sustainable, if you want it. The week before Christmas, I had, had, by my own accounting, exactly one shot at this landing the way I intended it to. Not as cruelty, not as a stunt, but as the actual beginning of something healthier, if anyone in that house was willing to receive it that way. My hands weren't shaking, packing those 12 boxes in my apartment 2 nights before Christmas. A strange, focused calm instead. The same steadiness I rely on in a trauma bay, when the adrenaline of the moment needs to stay entirely out of my hands. I labeled each box carefully with a marker, the way I'd label anything going into a discharge folder, making sure nothing would arrive looking careless or thrown together at the last minute. What kept me up at 1 a.m. that night wasn't fear of the confrontation itself. It was picturing Ava's face, 9 years old, expecting a drone under the tree, and understanding that whatever justice this moment delivered to the adults in that house, she was going to absorb some of the fallout regardless of how carefully I'd built the plan. I called Renata one final time that night, walking through the language of the sealed envelope line by line, making sure nothing in it could be misread as an attack rather than a boundary. She reassured me, the way she had in every session leading up to that point, that clarity delivered with calm was always kinder in the long run than years of resentment delivered in silence. The kids will be confused today, she told me. That's real, and it's not nothing. But confusion today is a lot smaller than the confusion Ava will carry at 19, wondering why nobody ever taught her that things cost something. It was Christmas morning or never, in the sense that mattered most. I'd rescheduled once already, and Renata had warned me that further delay would only give the old pattern more time to reassert itself, more time for everyone to quietly assume the drone was still coming after all. On Christmas morning, I skipped the toy store entirely. I showed up instead with 2 movers I'd hired for the morning, 12 large boxes stacked carefully in the back of a rented van, and a single sealed envelope tucked inside my coat pocket. The house smelled like cinnamon and bacon when I walked in, my mother's traditional Christmas breakfast already spread across the kitchen table. Tyler and Ava were bouncing off the walls with the specific, uncontainable excitement only Christmas morning produces in kids under 12. Then the boxes came through the front door behind me, and the excitement in the room shifted, almost instantly, into confusion. No drone, no PS6, no iPhones, budget plans, printed and organized in labeled folders, therapy referral packets from Dr. Webb's office, a stack of current job listings Jenna had compiled from 3 different staffing agencies, grocery support paperwork explicitly tied to counseling attendance, structured the way Renata and I had drafted it, line by line, and the sealed envelope, a clear, written boundary between what I would help with going forward and what I would no longer fund, not one more dollar, regardless of how the request was framed. Melissa tore the envelope open, standing in the middle of the living room, and went visibly pale reading it, her eyes moving faster and faster down the page like she was hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something else if she read quickly enough. The kids stared at the 12 boxes stacked by the tree like they'd somehow been robbed of something they'd already, in their minds, come to own. My mother's voice cracked from the kitchen doorway. "You're ruining Christmas!" My father, standing near the fireplace, didn't even raise his voice. "Leave!" Tyler screamed that he hated me, the words landing with a 13-year-old's full, unfiltered fury, before storming down the hallway and slamming his bedroom door hard enough to rattle a framed photo on the wall. Ava, only 9, looked at the empty space under the tree where a drone was supposed to be and started to cry. Not out of malice, not out of the same anger as her brother, just genuine confusion, because nobody had ever once explained to her that the gifts she'd been promised had been quietly funded, for years, by someone else's exhaustion. That part stung more than anything Melissa said to me that morning, more than my father's single word, more than Tyler's slammed door. I stood in that living room, the one I'd bought a smoke alarm for 2 weeks earlier, the one I'd bailed out financially more times than I could fully count even with a spreadsheet, and I didn't flinch, though everything in me wanted to. "I'm not funding habits that never change," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "I'll support growth, I won't support dependency. Everything in those boxes is a real path forward if anyone wants to take it, but the drone isn't coming, and it's not coming next year either, not unless something in this house actually changes." Nobody thanked me, nobody hugged me. The room went silent in that heavy, suffocating way that somehow carries louder than any shouted argument ever could. So I picked up my coat from the chair by the door, and I left. I didn't hear from my parents for almost 3 weeks after that Christmas morning. When my mother finally called, in early January, it wasn't an apology exactly, more a tentative, careful conversation about whether I'd be willing to explain the budget documents to her directly, since Melissa, she admitted quietly, hadn't opened most of the folder. Melissa herself didn't reach out for nearly 2 months. When she finally did, it was a short, awkward text asking for Renata Ochoa's contact information. Not an apology, not yet, but a first, genuine step I hadn't fully expected. She's completed 8 sessions with Renata as of this writing, and started 6 weeks ago, a part-time administrative position through one of the listings Jenna had originally compiled, her first steady paycheck in over 2 years. Tyler still isn't speaking to me much, 13 being 13, and I don't push it. Ava, surprisingly, sent me a handwritten thank you card in February, in careful, looping 9-year-old handwriting, thanking me for a smaller gift I'd mailed separately that January, a telescope, something she'd mentioned once months earlier, that had nothing to do with the original wish list at all. She wrote at the bottom, in slightly smudged pencil, "Mom said the drone was was too expensive anyways. I like the stars better. I keep that card taped inside a kitchen cabinet, where I see it most mornings making coffee before a shift. My father and I had one real conversation in February, the first honest one we'd had in years, where he admitted quietly that he'd known for a long time how lopsided things had become between his two children and hadn't known how to say anything without it sounding like he was choosing sides. I told him I understood. I'm not sure fully that I do yet, but I'm working on it. The same slow, unglamorous way Melissa is working on her own budget with Renata twice a month. I still send money home occasionally, but differently now, tied to specific documented purposes, discussed in advance, never again assumed. The spreadsheet I built that Tuesday night is still open on my laptop, updated monthly, not out of resentment anymore, just out of the same habit that makes me chart every patient carefully. Some things deserve a clear record, if only so nobody, including me, ever has to guess again.